Local Emergency Planning Committee and the West Virginia Climate Alliance. As a spokesperson for the grassroots organization, People Concerned About Chemical Safety, she testified twice in 2019 before the U.S. Congressional Committee hearings. Nixon spoke before the House Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection on securing our nation's chemical facilities, and before the House Committee on Transportation Subcommittee of Water Resources Environmental regarding the need to strengthen water quality regulations to reduce and remove hazardous chemical and discharges for recreational waterways, source water to public drinking water supplies. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome to the Black and Appalachia podcast.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hey, everybody. I am Enkeshi El-Amin, and I am a co-host of the Black and Appalachia podcast. Also, UT alum and some other things. Founding director. No.
Yeah, it's all switched.
Testing? All right. Hello again, everybody. I am Enkeshi El-Amin. I'm a sociologist of race and place in Black Appalachian experiences, co-host of the Black and Appalachia podcast, and founding director at the bottom.
What's good? I'm Pumpkin Starr. I'm a land and place baddie from Tennessee and Alabama. I'm also holding down Black and Appalachia on some episodes. I'm also working at the bottom. And I'm just about my things, I'm a musician, a creative,
She's about her things.
Self-proclaimed mountain baddie.
And we spend a lot of time together. We like each other. And today we are excited to be at Pumpkin's alma mater. What's up, UT?
Y'all owe me money.
We're excited to be here, and thank you all for joining us for this live recording of the Black and Appalachia podcast. If you've listened to our podcast, you know that we like to have a lot of fun. So feel free to join in the fun. We'll get serious, but also from time to time we like to laugh and keep it light. All right?
Yes.
So thank you, Ms. Pamela,
Thank you.
for agreeing to be here with all of our goofiness. And chatting with us this afternoon.
I warned Miss Pam. I said we're goofy, especially me. So
That's funny.
yeah, but thank you so much for being here. Like William said, you're a powerhouse. You really are. So
We are glad to get things about you.
Yeah. Thank you. So we first just wanted to kick it off talking about your home. Tell us about your home, however you want to tell us, good, bad, beautiful. But yeah, just tell us about your home and what your Appalachia is like.
Okay. Sure. I'm from West Virginia. I'm from what is known as Kanawha Valley. It's along the Kanawha River. I'm in the county called Kanawha. Hence the Kanawha Putnam Local Emergency Planning Committee. It has also been called Chemical Valley because of all the chemical plants that were there previously. We still have some, but in the past, it was all of the big name chemical plants from FMC to Monsanto to DuPont to Union Carbide. You name it, it was in Chemical Valley. I actually grew up in a hollow. In West Virginia, I guess you guys have maybe down here, I don't know. In Appalachia, especially in West Virginia, we have hollows. And I grew up in a hollow called, we call it Wilson Hollow. It is now, since the road has been paved, it is now called Works Avenue. And it was a mostly Black community in the east end of Charleston. Charleston is the capital of West Virginia. And it was located in the east end of Charleston. And we had, I went to an African-American elementary school. We had culture shock when I went to junior high because by then it was integrated. And also in my high school was integrated, Charleston High School, which is no longer there. I should say most of the schools that I went to are no longer there. I graduated from West Virginia State University, a historically Black university located in Institute. West Virginia Institute is a unincorporated town. It's or community, I guess I should say. It's mostly African Americans who live in Institute, Haber, West Virginia State University now is mostly white because a lot of the kids are commuters. West Virginia is 94% white, 4%, well, probably about 3% African American, and the rest are others. We have Hispanics and Asians that are also in West Virginia. And yes, West Virginia does have African Americans. I go places and they say, yeah, blacks are in West Virginia. Well, yeah.
It's out here. It's out here. We're everywhere.
So West Virginia is a beautiful state. Spring, the flowers are blooming and the trees are blossoming and it's just beautiful. In the summer, it's very lush with greenery. In the fall, the changing of the colors. And in the wintertime, well, even though with climate change, we still have some snow in the winter. So we have skiing, we have, if you're a hunter, we have hunting, but we also have rapids. There's whitewater rafting in West Virginia. So West Virginia is just a beautiful state, and I love it.
Awesome. Well, you mentioned about Chemical Valley, and we want to talk a little bit more about Chemical Valley, just to understand a little bit about the context of the place, right? And you mentioned all of these plants there. Why are plants there? Do you know? Can you talk a little bit about some of the history?
Well, West Virginia is full of natural resources. We have a lot of coal, we have oil and gas, especially now with the gas. We have Marcellus gas, we have Utica Formation, Marcellus Formation. It has a lot of gas, natural gas. Then there's the Utica Formation under there, and then the Rogersville under that. So we have a lot of natural resources. We also have logging. In the beginning, there was a lot of salt mines, especially in the Kanawha Valley. In fact, there's still sort of a working family salt business that's going on in the Kanawha Valley in a place called Malden, which is just outside of Charleston. And so that's what sort of, plus the Kanawha River is there. So that's what brought the companies to West Virginia, was because of the natural resources, because of the transportation, even though it was very mountainous and hard to get around through, but there was the Kanawha River, which leads into the Ohio River, which allowed the transportation of their products. So actually, I guess the first time that there was what I would consider an environmental injustice that occurred in West Virginia was probably back in the 30s, between 1930 and 1935, and it was the company Union Carbide was building a tunnel through what we call along Golly River. They were trying to divert some of the water so that they could have a hydroelectric power plant for their company that was called Alloy, which was the town was called Alloy because the company was there. And so when they were drilling through, they realized that there was a lot of silica there. And while they were doing that, they decided rather than to get a permit, they would drill really fast and get as much silica out of there, because it was more than likely 100% silica. And so they put out, for jobs to hire, they were hired. So a lot of blacks from the South came to West Virginia to work in the mines. There were some whites that were there. It was only a few hundred whites. It was more likely 2,000 or more African Americans that were there that were working. The silica was so pure that within weeks, the people who worked there were sick. The African Americans had it worse. The whites who worked there were given maybe 30 minutes for a break to go out to the fresh air. The African Americans weren't. They could have put water down the tunnel to keep some of the dust down, but they wanted to hurry up and get through. Watering would have slowed them down. So the dust was covering people. People around Golly mountain would actually call the people who worked in the silica mine, well, I call it a silica mine, it was supposed to be a tunnel, but they called them the walking dead, because even, they didn't have any showers for when they left work, so they actually went home to where they slept, and that, since the African Americans came from the South, they stayed in I guess you would call it boarding houses, but it was like several of them at one time in these spaces, and they didn't shower, so they couldn't shower, they didn't have a shower. So they wore and continued to breathe, you know, the silica that they had worked in all day. There was congressional hearing in the 30s regarding this, and the Congress said there were probably 109 people who died. Some said it was, and then there were some writings that said it was like 476 that died. But when you talked to the people who actually lived there, it was anywhere between 700 and 1,000 people that died. In fact, they were dying so quickly that they would load them on there was this undertaker that was burying them, and he was burying them in mass graves. They were unmarked graves, and they were loading the bodies onto the backs of the vehicles or trucks or carts or whatever they had back then. And it's just like cordwood, they just stacked them on top of each other. And according to the death certificates of the African Americans that worked in that tunnel, they were buried in unmarked graves. So that was the first environmental injustice that was done in West Virginia.
We did a Halloween show about that. And it's like, you're taking me back to like the horror of it, just hearing,
Yeah, and you know, like these, like I said, we talked about that for a Halloween episode, but I'm wondering how much of this history shapes how people think about their place. How do people think about Chemical Valley? How do they talk about it? How much of this history is a part of the everyday sort of understanding of this place?
Institute, West Virginia, the chemical plants sort of lined the river. It was like a 20-mile stretch of the river from Monsanto down in this town of Nitro, and Nitro was named that because it was a munitions town. And so from the town of Nitro, where Monsanto is, up through the town of Bell, which is where DuPont was, there was occidental chemicals, and as I said, and FMC and union carbide, and you name it. But the worst of the worst chemicals, even though these are all hazardous chemicals, the worst of the worst were actually located in Institute, West Virginia. In Institute, there was methyl isocyanate, and I'm looking out to see if you guys know about Bhopal, India. In 1984, in Bhopal, India, there was a methyl isocyanate release that killed thousands of people in Bhopal, thousands, in one night in Bhopal. The twin sister plant was located in Institute. And in fact, in Institute, Bhopal happened in December of 1984. In September of 1984, auditors had come to the Institute plant to look at the safety measures, to look at the processes and things that were in Institute. And they said that Institute posed an imminent danger to the community because excuse me, sorry. Institute posed an imminent danger to the community because the safety measures that would be there to protect the community from a catastrophic event were not adequate. And only by the grace of God, for Institute, not for Bhopal, for Institute, only by the grace of God that Institute didn't occur. And Bhopal occurred just, 4 months later. And I remember the day when it was on the news. It was just before Christmas. And I was in the, I'm a little bit older than you guys. So I was in the kitchen fixing dinner for my husband and family. when the news came across about Bhopal, and of course I stopped and looked at it, and they kept talking about this chemical MIC, methyl isocyanate, MIC. And I kept thinking, MIC, I know I've seen, what is MIC? And then I remembered, at that time I lived on a little narrow two-lane road, barely could get 2 cars by. But the 18-wheelers that transported MIC drove by my house to go to a truck wash, which was located in our community. And the truck wash, when they would wash the trucks after the trucks came back, sprayed the chemical out over our neighborhood. So not only were we downwind from the chemical plant, but the people that were closest to this truck wash was getting additional aerosol because of them cleaning the trucks. And MIC was written on the side of the trucks. And that's why I kept thinking I should know that. And immediately they stopped transporting the MIC. MIC at that time had been transported by 18-wheelers and by rail track. And rail track ran along behind our house. Institute is, I'll stop for a little second here and tell you about Institute. As I said, Institute is an mostly African-American community. It is, yes, with the historically Black university that's located there. Right across the street in front of my house was a park called Shawnee Park, which also had a golf course. And in here, the trucks were going down. So there's the plant and institute, which made not only MIC, but phosgene and toluene and benzene and 1,3-butadiene, and all of the chemicals that cause either nerve damage or cancer. But it made pesticides, and pesticides affect, the reason they use these chemicals is because the pesticides attack the neurological system of the pests. And we were breathing in that. So there's the Plant and Institute. There was West Virginia Paving, which is right across the other side of the railroad track. Institute sort of sits down in a little bowl because we're in a valley. So we sit sort of down in a little bowl. The plant is level with the university. In fact, you can still see some of the tanks, even though they've taken down some of the units down in Institute. You can still see the tanks sitting. If you're in the parking lot at West Virginia State University, you can. In fact, if I had pictures, I could show you where you could see the tanks from the parking lot at West Virginia State. So there was the chemical plant, which was actually probably its largest institute. Then there's the fence line. Then West Virginia State was right on the fence line of the chemical plant. Then toward the river, toward Canal River, is the West Virginia Paving, which also spews out benzene because it's a paving company, and along with the particulate matter. But also in Institute, and then there's the trucking companies. Right now, they're not washing the trucks in Institute, but there's still a trucking company that is located in Institute, which means there's still diesel fumes that's going out over that community. But just east of West Virginia, of Institute, just east of Institute is a town, a municipality called Dunbar. Dunbar's waste treatment plant is located in Institute. So there's this cumulative impact that's going on in Institute, which is a predominantly African-American community. And people, when we first began talking about it, people say, but chemical plants are all along the valley. Yeah, but the worst of the worst were located in Institute. When there would be a chemical incident, many called it chemical accidents. They weren't accidents, they could have been prevented. These were incidents. When there would be a chemical incident, people would look toward Institute. They knew it was going to be Institute. It wasn't going to be in South Charleston. There was hardly any up in Vail. Nitro had a horrible odor. Now, in Nitro, that Monsanto plant did, I will say, they did, that is all, those are low-income whites, that lives up in hollers. Also, like Hazard and Manila Creek, and Monsanto made dioxin or Agent Orange, many of you may know it as Agent Orange, and the waste they put up in those hollers where the poor whites live. And so this is the way the valley, when we started protesting, when people in Institute protested about the chemicals there, the people in South Charleston, where Union Carbide also had a facility, they did a counter protest. They said what we smelled was the smell of money.
Oh my goodness.
Now, the people in Institute did not reap hardly any of the benefits. Maybe there were 10 people that worked at the plant in Institute. The others did not, so we reaped all of the risks in Institute. In South Charleston, they hardly had any accidents. They did have some, don't get me wrong, they had some accidents, but they didn't have as many. Their chemicals were bad. They had, cancer-causing chemicals and neurological chemicals, also in chemicals that targeted the kidneys and the liver. So, but the largest amount of air emissions in the valley came from the Institute area. And so in the beginning, and all of this, when Bhopal happened, there were no right to know laws. So we didn't have a right to know what was being produced in the community. We didn't have a right to know what they were doing to prevent it from happening in the community. So when we would complain about it until 1980, all of this Institute, there was a release of chemicals in Institute in August of 1985. And I was involved, I was one of the victims of the release and ended up having to go to an area hospital. It's like 135 of us from Institute ended up having to go to area hospitals to get treatment. And I remember when the doctor, the Union Carbide doctor, called to check up on you. And of course, when I answered the phone, I still had this horrible cough. And he said, "You shouldn't have that. That's supposed to be short-lived." And I said, "Well, it's not." And I didn't know he was on the phone. I would pick it up and start coughing, coughed and had to wait, and then I answered the phone. And he said, "So how are you?" And I said, "I still have this cough." And he said, "Well, you shouldn't have." I mean, and that was the way they treated the people in the Institute. We were considered a nuisance, is the way it was, because we were the ones that were always complaining. We were the ones that always wanted to know what that odor was. And the people, and even when there was this organization, a nonprofit organization called National Institute for Chemical Studies, which began, it wasn't national, but they had hoped it would have gone national, but it was called the National Institute for Chemical Studies. And it was located in South Charleston. No, I'm sorry, it was located in Charleston. It wasn't in South Charleston, it was first located in Charleston. And so they set up meetings after the Bhopal issue and the Institute incident that sent 135 of us to area hospitals. And they set up meetings in each one of the 4 different regions in the Kanawha Valley, so that the communities could talk to the companies about what was going on, within the company. And this was around the time that the community right to know laws actually went into effect around 1986. And there was the Sarah Title III, the Superfund Amendment Reauthorization Act, occurred around then. In fact, Congress had meetings in Kanawha Valley as they were rewriting this act to give people the right to know what was going on in the community as a result of Bhopal and because of Institute. So we were able to get some information from the plants. But as I went to the different meetings, from the meeting that was held in Vail around DuPont, the meeting that was held in South Charleston around Union Carbide, then the meetings that were held in Nitro around Monsanto, those communities got more information than we did. In fact, at one of our meetings, after another release that had occurred in Institute, one of the plant managers said, well, if y'all are gonna act like this, then we just won't tell you when we have a release. And so this is the way the people in Institute have been treated up until only recently. And when I say only recently, we have been trying to hire, well, in fact, we had hired a couple of lawyers to plead our case, because of the chemicals. And sometimes the judge would listen, and sometimes they would throw out some of the testimonies. But recently, I was contacted by a law firm and to talk. Now, I haven't gone to talk. I'm not quite sure what the discussion is going to be this time, because now we have ethylene oxide, which is really high on the priorities now for EPA. And ethylene oxide is released in two different areas in the Kanawha Valley, in Institute and in South Charleston. They bring it in, and it used to be made in Institute back in the 70s. In fact, some of the workers in the 1970s at Union Carbide in South Charleston were part of a study on ethylene oxide. So it's been around since the 1970s, since before the 1970s. And the study was done in the 70s. And Institute was actually the place where they made ethylene oxide. And then there were underground pipelines, and they would pipe it to the South Charleston plant. We actually had conflagrations. Sorry, they weren't explosions, they were conflagrations. We call them explosions and fires. They said, no, it's conflagration. So we had a conflagration in Institute back in the 90s, and it was ethylene oxide. And ethylene oxide is a very potent cancer-causing chemical. At that time, EPA had not said it was cancer-causing in humans. It was a suspected carcinogen. But the workers at the plant actually told me that they knew that it was cancer-causing, and that we needed to have been concerned about that. Not only did we have a conflagration that went on for hours, and they just let it burn out, there was also a big fish kill that had also occurred that day in the Kanawha River. So I'm just sort of jabbering on. I'm sorry. And so that is the way it has been in Institute now. Since ethylene oxide, and this is only one chemical, ethylene oxide, and as I said, there's multiple chemicals there in the Kanawha Valley that are hazardous. But they found out that ethylene oxide is now 30 times more potent than what they thought it was. So they're holding meetings across the country. They've held meetings in Texas and Louisiana. EPA and DEP held a meeting in September in West Virginia. We're supposed to have another meeting this spring to give an update on what they're doing. They've nailed it. You would think they would have been monitoring it. They now have been monitoring the ethylene oxide. In fact, they did it in January. The DEP took grab samples. But now the air is not as dirty as it was back in the 70s. In fact, EPA, when they give a description of ethylene oxide, they said that you have their acceptable rate for cancer is 1 in a million. And so in Institute, it is 349 in a million. However, in South Charleston, there is one area across the river, which also is a low-income area. And that community had, I'm thinking 800 in a million. It's what the recent evaluation of it, assessment of the air toxics were from ethylene oxide. So the Canal Valley, even though it's cleaner, it's if you can imagine it, it is cleaner. It is cleaner. Yeah. But EPA said if, you know, when they're doing the assessment, it's the number of people who may potentially get cancer over a 70-year period by living in the same spot and standing in the same spot for 70 years. So I am now 70. And I keep asking the question, okay, but the air is a little cleaner now. How do you assess the health of people, now I didn't grow up in Institute. I grew up, as I said, in a hollow up in Charleston. So I haven't spent actually 70 years in the Institute area or in the South Charleston area. But many of the people, especially in Institute, that were there, who were my age, when I first moved to Institute, I now live in South Charleston, but I lived in Institute for about 12 years. The adults who are my age, many of them are dead with cancer. Some from oral cancer, cancer of the throat, cancer of the mouth, that's 1,3-butadiene is known for that. And then there were several that died from brain tumors and from kidney cancer. And so because it's such a small community and so many different cancers were there, it's hard for them to find a causation for the cancer. And many people said, well, you know, it's probably your way of life. And no, it's the zip code. That's all it is to it, it's the zip code. And so, but even with all of that, we seem to still like our town. You know, it's your home. Yeah. And I've been saying, you know, I've been told, well, why don't you just move? Because if I move, then my relatives can't move with me. Not everyone can move out. And so, you know, plus I was able to have a decent career there. I had two careers, as a matter of fact. I was a medical technologist at area hospitals there, which meant I worked in the laboratory. I did the tests on the blood, which is one reason that we did pulmonary function tests on coal miners from black lungs. So that was sort of an impetus in me looking at the environment. And then I got married and moved to the Institute, and well, that was the other one. And so I went back to school, got my master's in environmental science, and then went to work with the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, hoping that they were actually protecting. But they give out permits. They write permits that allow companies to pollute. So it's, you know, you think one thing when you go to work there. So I worked there for 15 years. In fact, that's where I retired from, was from the DEP. So, and while I was at the DEP, I was the environmental advocate, which meant that I worked with all the communities all over the state. So I'm talking mostly about Chemical Valley, but we have a lot of places that are just as bad. There's Minden, which is where there's a lot of dioxin, and it's in Fayette County. There are the gas fields, which are in northern, around Wetzel County in West Virginia. I work with those communities because of the pollution that comes from the venting of the natural gas as they're doing the drilling. Then there's the coal mines, and there's the landfills, and then there, you know, you name it, we have it in West Virginia. West Virginia, as I said, have a lot of natural resources, and so it's both a blessing and a curse, because, you know, we have coal mining, and coal mining will come in boom or bust. You know, they do a lot of coal mining, and then they wouldn't do any coal mining. But the same way with natural gas and with the oil, and so, and in each one of the regions, it's our workforce isn't very, when I say diverse, I'm talking about the different kind of jobs that people can have. Most of the jobs are what's in that region at that time. And so and you would think with all of the natural resources, West Virginia would be a prosperous state. Well, no, because most of the mineral rights and things are owned by out-of-state companies. And so the money goes out of state. The people in West Virginia have the surface rights, but not the mineral rights. And so the money leaves the state. And so what they're getting is what they're paid for. There's some people who are lucky enough to have the rights to the minerals under their property, such as the natural gas and things. And so they are getting paid some money. But when you look at West Virginia as a whole, that's one of the reasons why we're one of the poorest states, if not the poorest state in the country.
It's like incredible, just gaslighting, and it's part of like the power of the industry being there. They're just like telling you like nothing's wrong. What are y'all talking about? What y'all are complaining? And just living with that, and always having to confront that and fight that, that constant threat that's always happening. What are the people there? You kind of mentioned y'all are organizing, y'all are protesting. What's the day-to-day life? How are people living with these monsters, these industry monsters? I'm gonna say it.
Yeah. Right now, the legislature is in session in West Virginia. I think it may end this weekend. And then during the summer, we have interim sessions. But right now, they're in session looking at bills, and what they're doing is actually gutting a lot of the environmental regulations. The majority of the legislators are more conservative, and so our water regulations, they're allowing more toxins to be put into our water. Why? This is the reason. I love this reason. Because West Virginians are overweight. We don't eat a lot of fish. And so our bodies, I guess, should be able to absorb more toxins. is the way, because they did a little study and they said, well, you don't eat a lot of fish, so we can put more toxins into the water because you're not eating a lot of the fish that are there, but we don't eat the fish because we know there's toxins in the water. There's a lot of mercury that's there because of the 96% of the energy in West Virginia, our electricity, comes from coal. So we have coal-fired power plants that are all around. And of course, then that releases the mercury and arsenic and things into the waterways. And so our waters are already polluted. And when it goes through the drinking water system, that doesn't filter out all of the chemicals. But West Virginia is open for business. And so therefore, it's, since we don't have the majority, since the more liberal folks don't have the majority, and since it's more of a fossil fuel state, it's difficult to get climate change laws passed. In fact, I spoke this session against repealing the ban to construct and operate nuclear power plants. So they repealed that. And so we don't have any laws on the books to protect us from the construction of nuclear power plants. So now, and so now they're looking at, in fact, I saw where Senator Capito and Senator Manchin were discussing, nuclear power for West Virginia, Anyway, that's the way it is. And we're fighting every day. I mean, we do have people who are lobbying the legislature every day to try to prevent them from gutting these bills. We had a few years back in 2014, there was a water incident in West Virginia that affected 9 different counties. And it was when a chemical called NCHM and another chemical called PPH were released into the water in the Elk River. And the West Virginia Water Company did not shut off their valves because they said it was in the wintertime, and they said that so many of the storage tanks were low, so they couldn't shut off the valve, because if there was a fire, then the fire departments wouldn't have pressure to fight a fire and all of this stuff. So it got into our water system. You could smell the licorice. It smelled like licorice, and you could smell it as you would run the water. And we were only allowed to flush our toilets with that water. We were not supposed to bathe in it, drink it, wash dishes in it, fix baby formula, or anything from that water. It was only good enough to flush the clothes. And we were like that for weeks. And I remember CDC coming into town, and we finally asked them, they said, you can drink the water now. And we said, but is the water safe? And they said, you can drink the water now. And then 2 days later, they said, wait a minute, maybe pregnant women shouldn't drink the water. Excuse me? If pregnant women can't drink the water, maybe we're not gonna drink the water. And so it was a long time that they had to actually have places where people could go to pick up their drinking water. And so, West Virginia, we're just, we feel almost like a third world country, because we're in the middle of Appalachia, where of course in Appalachia when we had that water incident, they already told EPA, stay out of our business. You're doing an overreach, because at that time EPA was trying to already clean up the water that was in West Virginia, and they said, if you're doing an overreach, we don't need you here. We had the incident. They said, well, where's President Obama? Where's EPA? And I'm thinking, okay, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so, and that's the way things are in West Virginia. There's still talk, and right now it used to be that the DEP would shadow whatever the EPA did. But if they made their regulations, if they strengthened their environmental regulations, the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection would also strengthen. We would shadow what the EPA did. Now our legislature has passed a law that the DEP cannot make any regulations more stringent until it comes through the West Virginia legislature. And then, mind you, only 1 or 2 maybe are doctors in the legislature. And so this has now become political. And the lives of the people in West Virginia is the health and safety is now political. And so now might be the time I move out.
I don't even know what to say. So, listening to all this, when you think about, we say, we've said it on the podcast before, it's intentional. The fact that Appalachia's poor is it's not coincidental, right? And you see why it matters that people are kept poor in these spaces, right? And there's a whole lot to process. But as we think about, you're involved in many different organizations, or have been over the years. When you think about the Black organizing spaces that you've been in, or multicultural organizing spaces that you've been in, why do you think it's important for Black Appalachians to do this work, right? In a space like West Virginia, where Black folks are 3% of the population, right? And in the region in general, relatively small, why is it important for Black folks to be involved in this type of work?
I'll put it like this: when as I said, our legislature is in session. When we go to the legislature, we were there a few weeks ago, and again we'll be there this coming Friday. They take notice because they don't see us at the legislature, and so it is important that they realize that we consider this important. They're used to seeing their own, people that look like them, whites, coming to the legislature. But the environmentalists, even though the majority are white, I don't think maybe I'm the only one. I may be the only one that's really outspoken. I think there's some younger ones now that are coming on the scene. But in the beginning, they looked at those who were lobbying against a lot of chemicals as hippies, as coming from out of town, and when many of them were born in West Virginia. But of course, they were poor, so they didn't always have on the suits. So they were just marginalized and have been. It's the money talks, and when the legislators are running for office, they need the money, and when they get hundreds of thousands of dollars from industry and industry lobbyists to have them vote their way, and who are claiming to bring jobs into the state, and they do bring jobs into the state, but they're bringing jobs at a cost, and it's costing West Virginians, not just African Americans, but as I said, the low income whites, and even the ones who are educated enough to get a job as an operator in the plant. Those individuals, their lives are also in harm's way. And we're still having coal miners that are dying in the coal mines. In fact, just a week ago, we had a guy who had spent 20 years underground, who was experiencing coal mining, who was hit with an air drill and killed immediately in the coal mine. So, and then there's black lung that's still there. We still have people who are coming down with black lung in West Virginia. So it's difficult, but it's a beautiful, and I have to keep going back. It is a beautiful state, and when you grow up someplace, it's almost like the people in the Ukraine. They keep saying they want to go back home. That's their home, and West Virginia is my home, and so it's.
Yeah, it's like easier for folks who don't belong to the place to tell you to leave.
Right.
It's easier for folks that don't belong to your people to tell you to live away from them.
Right.
And it just makes me think of, like you were mentioning, like you don't see yourself to the people that you're coming to say, like, yo, check my life, check my family, check our health and our safety. And we see that going through, like, just throughout Appalachia, like it's overwhelming to think how it happens in West Virginia. But, really, I'm sitting here and I'm holding, like, there's a town not too far from here, that deals with, poisoned lands and it's from industry, it's all throughout. And I just think about, like, how are your family, how are the other Black community around you? Because you're out here, like you're here, you're like everywhere, you're in these streets, Ms. Pam. And like, how are your community? How are they standing alongside with you?
And
While you're doing this, yeah.
And they are. They're standing, you must realize that these are working people.
Yeah. So
they have jobs. Yeah. They have families. They go to work. Some of them are working a couple of jobs. And so they don't have all the time in the world to be able to go to the legislature to speak out. They tell me, thank you. and when we have a Zoom session, because everybody has Zoom sessions now, more people are able to come to the Zoom. You see more African Americans on Zoom now than you see coming to the meetings, because you know, they're just getting home. They probably have the food on cooking, and then they turn off the camera, run to the food, they come back and sit down until you see people disappearing, and then they come back. And we've never been to the point where we're complacent.
Yeah.
It's just that we just, you know, are busy, we have families, and the kids have sports after school, you know, the typical family, and it's just difficult for them to try to make ends meet and be able to attend the meetings, because many of these meetings are held in the daytime. When I speak at the legislature, it's in the daytime.
Yeah.
When I go to speak before Congress, it's in the daytime. They aren't able to do that. I was lucky enough to have jobs where I had vacation time. Many people are working 2 jobs because they're working 2 part-time jobs. That means they don't have time for vacation. And so therefore they can't do all this stuff. I was able to do that. I could, when I worked in the hospital, I worked evenings and midnights. I left my days open. So I could do things in the daytime. People didn't think I worked because I was always at these meetings, but I worked midnights. I'd go to a meeting, come home, take a nap before work, and then go back to work. And I was also taking classes at some of these things. In fact, when we did when they did the risk management plans, which was in the mid-90s, I was getting my master's in environmental science. And so what was my master's doing? I sort of was doing a double duty because I was working at a hospital, but I was, my paper that I was writing was on air dispersion modeling. And so what I was learning from the companies who didn't know I was learning from them, I was using, and also using that information and being able to educate the community on what was going on. And so, you know, that's the way it is. And because, you know, people are too busy, and a lot of people don't understand all of this jargon. When you go to a meeting, the companies will forever say things in acronyms. And if you don't know what the acronyms mean, you can't answer a question. And then they say, any questions? Well, no, because I didn't understand what you said. And so I'm there at the meeting saying, okay, can you tell us what that acronym is, and can you explain the process that you're talking about? But that's the only way the community is going to learn. And so, and every time, and I'm now at an age where I want to actually retire. I've already retired from work, but I haven't retired because I'm still busy doing all of the environmental things, because I'm volunteering on climate and climate justice and the NAACP and working with the EPA to make sure that they're coming back and giving updates to the community and contacting the DEP, and also working with Earth Justice and with NRDC, trying to make sure that we have the information that we need to be able to, for the community to be able to answer questions so that we can get some action done. Right now, the EPA, even though a lot of the information that they have on ethylene oxide, as I said, which is high priority now for EPA, they collected this information in 2014. In 2016, they assessed it and realized that it was more potent, that ethylene oxide was more potent than what they had thought it was. But they didn't release a report until 2018. They didn't start holding meetings until 2021. They're not going to reassess the regulations and decide whether they need more stringent regulations until 2014. Well, that's 10 years. We've already had decades of breathing in this stuff. You know, it's when they say government works slowly, it's at a snail's pace. And we're still trying to get them to, and I know that because I work for the state government, and we're still trying to get them to the point where there's more action, and it's done, you know, quickly, because people are dying and people have died as a result of this. And we need to not only look at ethylene oxide, but to look at all of the other chemicals, to look at the cumulative impacts that are going on within the communities.
Ollie tricking. And like you mentioned it, like, and I think about this sometimes too. I'm just like, it's so expensive. It's just expensive. It costs more money to live, and so we aren't really empowered with time, just having time. And it seems like, you still built power at a grassroots level. And we wanted to ask you about the group that you're part of, that you're a spokesperson of, the people concerned about chemical safety. Can you tell us about just who that is, and who you're talking to and who you're targeting with your group?
And the organization People Concerned, it used to be called, the original name was People Concerned About MIC. That's where it started.
Okay.
And it started in 1985, actually took off in 1986. But it was after, finally in 2011, when they stopped producing MIC, that's how long they continued to produce it in the Institute. When they stopped producing MIC, it was when we changed the name to People Concerned About Chemical Safety. And then only recently, we've sort of gone dormant because, people, after you work, I'm just one of the crazy ones, but after you've worked at something for a long time, people sort of, they have their lives that they have to live. And many of the people that were on a board of directors have, either their parents have gotten older and they're taking care of the parents, and so they've gone their separate ways, and so it's sort of gone dormant, but we still use that name. We now no longer are 501c3 because we didn't have the board of directors and all of that, but we still have people in the Institute when we speak. Of course, I keep saying we. I don't even live in Institute anymore, but my heart's there. I live in South Charleston, which is where the other ethylene oxide plant is. But we work together, especially poor Kathy Ferguson. She's younger than me, thank goodness she has energy. and she was saying that she was becoming overwhelmed, and I looked at her and I said, excuse me. and what do you think? And so Kathy is now out there and being the spokesperson for People Concerned and for the people in Institute, because she still lives in Institute. Yeah. And so but the people, since the ethylene oxide is in both areas in actually in North Charleston, because it goes across the river. In South Charleston and Charleston are two different cities. I live in the city of South Charleston. And then there is the city of Charleston, which is the capital of West Virginia. But the way the air blows, it blows it to the north side of Charleston, which is where, it's sort of the northwest side of Charleston, which is where the low-income whites, low-income blacks live. And so we now have people in those areas now who realize, because back then in South Charleston, they actually, even though they could, periodically smell the fumes, they really didn't consider themselves in any danger until EPA put out their maps, which included the north part of Charleston, the north part of Charleston in the mapping. And now we have people there who are also interested. And so so in September, when EPA and DEP held that meeting, there were 178 people, which is pretty good when you think about it, because West Virginia only has 1.8 million people in the whole state of West Virginia. And so there's only maybe 50,000 people in Charleston. I guess you could say 75,000 when you consider the surrounding areas of Charleston. And so to get 178 people on a weeknight to tune into Zoom to listen to about chemicals, and it's in these very targeted areas. So we really had a pretty good number that were there and that were listening, that were asking questions, and white and black. And so we now have more of there's more people who are asking questions, who are requiring or who are looking toward the DEP and EPA to actually take action, because it's above their action level. As I said, the EPA considers 1 in a million acceptable. 100 in a million is considered action level. 300 plus in a million is an institute. And around 600 or 800 in a million, or so the map says, is in the Charleston area. And so now we have the people in Charleston and some of the council people, Charleston City Council members, are interested because these are their constituents. But it's coming from another city, which is South Charleston. And so it's now them trying to see what can be done to be able to work to get the companies to reduce the amount of emission. When I first brought this before Dow, which owns Union Carbide now is a subsidiary of Dow. When I first brought this to our, what we call our CAP meeting, our Citizen Advisory Panel, even though we don't advise, which is what the companies do. They have these meetings with the community people. When I asked Dow about that, their spokesperson about that, she said, well, we're within our permit limits. Yes, they are. And that's what's making it harder. Until DEP and EPA work together to find ways to make the regulations more stringent, to bring in not only what's vented out, but what is coming from the cracks or connections in the pipes, which is called fugitive emissions. Until we can do that, it's difficult. And so that's what we're now working on. And we've known about fugitive emissions all along, and leak detection and repair, and all of this since the 90s. But but when they're working within the amount of their permits and they're allowed to vent whatever it is that they're allowed to, it's hard to work with companies to have them reduce their emissions over the communities.
I mean, this is a lot. Like, I'm just trying to understand all of this, right? You're there on the ground. I can understand why the woman is overwhelmed, right? Like, it's overwhelming. It's a lot of, and these are many different communities. I'm hearing this, and then I hear you say that the EPA is where things can be tightened to have an impact, right? How can people outside of West Virginia, in the region, in the country in general, support these efforts, right? Are there things that we can do outside of West Virginia to support these efforts?
Yes, like I said, many communities all across the country who are living in manufacturing communities are talking about cumulative impacts, and not just ethylene oxide, but all of the cancer-causing chemicals, right to your state or your legislators, your U.S. Senate, U.S. Congress, I'm sorry. And as I said, our West Virginia legislature is in session, and that's where my mind is. But right to your U.S. Representatives, to have them work with EPA to reduce the amount of emissions. As I said, I've gone there and I've talked, that they're holding committee meetings on this information, on the cumulative impacts. And so if we could strengthen that would be one thing, because it's these chemicals, especially ethylene oxide, and that's why I keep going back to that. I know where those states are, and that's Texas and Louisiana, and West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and in other areas, there's about 25 different communities across the country that are living with ethylene oxide. And so, and ethylene oxide isn't the only chemical that's being emitted, so contact your US representatives and hopefully they will tighten the regulations because the people in these communities are dying, and they're dying waiting for help.
So give them help. Questions. Like, I don't want this to end.
What else can you add? That's energy safety.
But yeah, this one's kind of, this is a more positive question. Yeah. So yeah, you're talking a lot about your home, the environment, how it's being, impacted by this. We wanted to, on our last question, just ask, like, what is your relationship to nature, to the land? We're giving you you said it was beautiful.
It is beautiful.
Yeah.
And I love to, any place in West Virginia, just about, any place in West Virginia. It takes on maybe just 10 minutes and you're in the forest or, out in nature. There's waterfalls everywhere, or there's birds. I sit on my deck, there's squirrels. I have deer in my backyard. I've seen red fox in our community. I have pictures of raccoons and possums in my trash cans. but we have, but it's everywhere, especially the deer. I have a little 4x4 area that I call my farm, and it's just a little raised garden. And believe me, last year I had one plant. I had one lone butter squash that survived because the deer thought that I planted it for them. And I have come home and they're sitting beside my house waiting, for the plants to grow. So yeah, it's just beautiful. We call it wild and wonderful West Virginia. That's exactly what it is. I have relatives that come in from New Jersey, and I always try to take them around the state and because her husband doesn't think West Virginia has anything of value. So I take them around the state to show them all of the beautiful sites. We have a Hare Krishna temple that's located in West Virginia. So I'm going to take them there this year if they're able to come in. But there's Blennerhassett Island, there's all of these places. And the last time that they were in, I took them to a grist mill, which is where they grind up the corn. And there's the waterfalls and everything. And as we were driving, a black bear ran across in front of the car. So they got to see our state black bear, because the black bear is our state animal. And I didn't hit him. But it was a beautiful black bear. I mean, totally black with the little brown nose and things. And so it's perfect. They just ran across in front of the car. So yeah, that's nature is always around us.
Awesome. This has been.
Well, it's the end.
Well, it doesn't have to end. We can open up for some Q&A.
Well, let's ask some questions. I was like, I want to ask you, like, what you do? Like, how you chill, how you kick back, That's the last question. Then I'll let you go, I'll leave you out to, how you chill, how you,
Can
you kick it?
Yeah, I have a small house because I have been affected by the chemicals, even though I wasn't able to sue because so many chemicals are there and there's the causation. But when you read about the issues that occur in Bhopal, autoimmune disorders was one of them that occurred after the Bhopal incident with the MIC. And as I said, those chemicals were also released probably about 8 or 9 months after Bhopal happened. We had a big release and Institute to send, as I said, 135 to the area hospital. And so I also ended up with an autoimmune disorder, and it was my skin. Pemphigus vulgaris is the name of it. So I ended up off from work for like 2 years, and so when I ended up going back to work, it was like starting all over because I had to, there was the chemo drugs and all this other stuff that I was on. So I ended up using all of my savings and all of that. So I ended up when I did divorce, and I did get a divorce. So after I got a divorce and I bought a house, I just bought a small 2-bedroom house, 1 bath, just big enough for me, my cat and dog. And but I always laugh and say it's my bed and breakfast. Because my relatives, for some reason, no matter how big everybody else's house is, where do they want to stay? They want to stay with me. And so I always have to, I tell them they have to reserve a space. So sure, come on.
We'll reserve.
Come on. I have an extra bedroom, you can sit on my deck. What'd you say?
I already said I already called dibs over there.
Okay.
We're coming through Charleston next week, right? So.
Oh, that's right. You were telling me that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can give you sort of a toxic tour. I mean, that's what we call it. We should probably do the toxic tour. And
Are y'all toxic while y'all do the toxic tour? Like being like going through and being like, seems like you've been gaining weight. Yeah. Also, this plant.
What we call a toxic tour of the Institute area in South Charleston area. Show you where the chemical plants are and where the other facilities are located in the Institute, where I said it was surrounded by all of these, the paving company and the waste treatment plant and the trucking company, all of that down in the Institute. And to show you we all actually have in Institute now, there's a sports complex that's there, but kids from all over the region come to Institute to play soccer and lacrosse. So that's located in Institute. I mean, it's really a nice place if it wasn't for all that.
So you can breathe the air.
Yeah.
All right, we open up.
I want to first just give you a round of applause for them.
And now we will open up to our audience to a little bit of Q&A.
I hope I didn't scare any of you guys. Please come to West Virginia. It is a nice place. The wind blows, so the air isn't too stagnant.
Here, I can
All right.
be
Here you go.
the microphone person.
I'm still good.
Like Phil Donahue.
Great. All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was really, really fascinating and really enlightening. My question is kind of about how much these things are kind of normalized within the community and how much work it is to actually educate the community on like what chemicals are going to this. Because I mean, they seem aware of like the relationship between these toxic chemical plants and illness and things like that. But, I feel like it seems to kind of been normalized to a certain extent. Like it's just kind of part of life. Like sometimes you can't drink the water, sometimes you can. And how much of this has to actually, in terms of activism, be something where you're actually educating people who live there on what's going on?
Well, we've been educating people about it since the 80s. So it actually is sort of normalized. And when you go there, people will talk, sort of talk about, this is called Chemical Valley. I mean, everybody knows that the chemicals are there. In the 1990s, we did what we consider a rollout of the worst case scenario. If a really catastrophic event would occur in the valley, what areas would it affect, and how would it affect them, and what would you do to protect yourself? And that was as a result of my sending a letter, and at that time it was people concerned about MIC, in the name of people concerned, and to get the companies, and at that time EPA was also in the process of writing regulations on the risk management plans, on what the companies had to do to have a risk management plan, and how they had to get the information out to the public. And so so we actually had worst case scenarios at every one of the chemical plants in the valley. And it showed in the newspaper, the overlapping, and because we did ours, it scared all the other communities and none of the others did theirs across the country. So they decided, maybe we won't do this. This will show terrorists where the chemicals are. No one's ever come there and terrorized all that. So, that's the way that is. But it showed that many of these chemicals would go out 20 to 30 miles if there was a catastrophic release from that one unit at that facility. And so people do recognize what's going on. But I also told the companies to be sure, and because they kept saying, well, people are going to go running, screaming to get out of the Canal Valley. I said, tell them what you've been doing to protect them. I mean, once they see what could happen and what has happened, since most of it only happened in the Institute, and see what could happen, what hasn't happened, then, they'll have more respect for what you're doing. And so people didn't mind leaving. Now, more people left after 2014 with the water spill than did as a result of anything else. I think that our mass export of folks from West Virginia is because there's no jobs that are there. If you don't want to work in the chemical plant, if you don't want to, and people could work from home. They did. I mean, during the pandemic, they have worked from home. But a lot of the areas in the really mountainous part of West Virginia, the kids had to go to McDonald's to be able to get the Wi-Fi to be able to do their homework. And so, West Virginia if we could just bring it into the present and on into the future, it would. But for tourists and people like that, it's a beautiful place. In fact, this winter, since it was cold enough and we had more snow, we have, as I said, skiing and things in West Virginia. We have Snowshoe, which is one of the ski resorts in West Virginia. And they did great business this winter. We have lots of little festivals that go on. We have the John Henry Festival. I don't know if people know who John Henry is, but he was a steel driver man. but it was located in West Virginia, the tunnel that he was fighting, competing against that machine in is located in West Virginia. And so we have John Henry Days and things like that. We have Sternville Regattas. We have a lot of water. But because of the terrain, there's water everywhere, that goes down and drains into the Ohio River. But we have the New River, which is great for whitewater rafting. And so.
Thank you.
Yes.
So throughout the whole discussion, you have talked a lot about how in West Virginia, the legislature is predominantly conservative and how money talks and how they're focused on bringing jobs. Is there any part of this conversation that they're sympathetic to or that can help pull them across the aisle?
In the past, West Virginia was mostly a Democrat state. Now it's more conservative. As you can tell from one of our Democratic senators, he's more conservative. And that's the way the state has grown. And people still want the jobs. People want clean water. People want clean air. And I think but people need jobs. I mean, we have a large drug problem in West Virginia. A lot of it's because there's, especially down in what was known as the coal fields, many of the coal mines have closed. And so they just don't feel empowered to do a lot. And they're stuck down there. And travel, if you don't have a car down in some of the areas in West Virginia is very rural. And if you don't have cars, it's difficult to get about. And so there's a drug problem, and people say, if we can get jobs to those areas. But the jobs that were there were the coal mining jobs. It's now trying to diversify types of businesses that come in. And that's why we're trying now to get more broadband. Plus, people are wanting a quality of life. West Virginia, as I said, is beautiful, and it has all these streams, and it has these trees, and it has all these animals, and we have to, actually in Philippines, we have what is known as the animal reserve, which shows all of the animals in West Virginia. And I remember my cousin and I going there, and it's like a 5-mile circular trek you go around, and they have all the West Virginia animals, including buffalo, because buffalo was once there. And then there's the elk, which has been reintroduced to West Virginia. And we have coyotes, and all of nature is there. And I remember as we were walking around, looking at the animals in the cages, and of course the seats were like our back was to the woods, and my cousin saying, because we could hear something behind us, saying, and I'm saying, but they're in the cages, and she said, no. I'm hearing something back here. We're in the woods. Yeah, it's hopefully we can change their minds. But this session, we've been able to push back. Some of the gutting that they were gonna do, they've, sort of taken some of it out of the legislation. But they're still trying to, they're trying to think of ways to get more businesses in. Only thing is, to me, they're chasing smokestacks instead of chasing things that will add to people's quality of life. And we know we need jobs. We know we need good paying jobs. And the good paying jobs are usually, from what West Virginia is known, has been in manufacturing and the natural resources. But if we could get more broadband, we'd have more diversity in the job market in West Virginia. I hope I answered your question. Okay.
Any questions? So look at that. Well, look at here. We have come to the end of our session. We can continue to talk after everybody leaves, but we are at the end of our session. And we really just want to thank you, Ms. Pam. This has been a really informative, you're a great person to chat with. We've enjoyed you. So thank you so much for agreeing to come to Knoxville to do this here today. We really appreciate it.
Talk about your life, talk about your health, talk about, I know you're not, we're not taking it lightly, right? We definitely feel there's like a responsibility of hearing your story. So I just really want to convey that to you, is that we hope that this gives you, we're not a huge platform, but we just want to give you another one. We want to help you get your word out, and I'm really sitting on what you said, what we can do. I'm really sitting on that, and I'm ready to do some things. And so, yeah, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you for teaching us today. Yeah.
So please come to West Virginia. And I don't want to scare you guys away, because it is, as I said, it's a rural area, so there's places that are out there that are beautiful. Yeah, I mean, that don't have the chemical companies right at the back.
Sorry, what's going on? You're there.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, so there'll be another session here at 2:00 with Drew Lanham from Clemson University about birds and race and place. And so pick up some stickers on the way out. Got lots of little Black and Appalachia things over there. And I think if you want a book, you have to pay for that. But, yeah, you'll be able to listen to this, if you want to listen to it again, it'll be on the University of Tennessee Humanities Center's YouTube page, but then also on when the Black and Appalachia third season podcast comes out. So you can listen to it again. Thanks for coming out.